Frank was a simple man who lived a simple life. He didn't ask for much, and he never liked drama. He worked as a school teacher in a small town in Ohio, where people knew each other by name and still waved at each other on the streets. Was the kind of man who believed in honesty, kindness, and living a quiet, good life. His days were filled with teaching kids, reading books, and spending time with his wife. Margaret was just like Frank, humble, gentle, and full of love. She worked at a local bakery downtown. People loved her not just because she made the best apple pies, but because she always smiled and remembered everyone's name. When Frank first met her, she was wiping flour off her apron and laughing at something her boss had said. That laugh stayed with him for years. They met in the 1960s. The world was changing back then, music, clothes, ideas, but Frank and Margaret didn't care much for big changes. They liked things the old-fashioned way. Their first date was at a local diner where they shared a milkshake and talked for hours. Frank wasn't very talkative, but with Margaret, he opened up. She asked thoughtful questions and really listened. She wasn't loud or flashy. She didn't wear bright makeup or fancy clothes. But there was something warm about her, something that made you feel safe. After 2 years of dating, they got married in a small church. It wasn't a grand wedding, just close family, a few friends, and a lot of love. Margaret wore her mother's wedding dress, and Frank couldn't stop smiling. He looked at her like she was the only person in the world, and to him she really was. Their life together was not filled with wealth or luxury, but it was full of moments that mattered. They bought a small house on Maple Street with a white fence and a rose garden in the front yard. Every spring, Margaret would plant new flowers, and every morning, Frank would water them before heading to work. They didn't have expensive furniture or shiny things. Their couch was second-hand, and their dishes didn't match, but their home felt warmer than any mansion. Years passed. They had 2 children, a boy named David and a girl named Emily. Raising kids wasn't always easy. Money was tight sometimes. And there were nights when Frank had to stay late grading papers while Margaret baked extra pies to sell. But they never fought about money. They always found a way to smile through the hard days. When David fell off his bike and broke his arm, Margaret stayed with him in the hospital while Frank read stories to Emily at home. They worked together as a team, like 2 hands of the same body. What made their relationship special was their deep understanding of each other. Frank knew when Margaret needed quiet time, and Margaret knew when Frank was worried, even if he said nothing. She had her little habits like sipping tea in the garden every Sunday or writing in her diary each night. Frank never read her diary, not once. He believed in privacy and trust. They didn't travel much. The farthest they went was a weekend trip to the mountains for their 25th wedding anniversary. But they made memories in small ways. They would sit on the porch swing every evening, even in winter, with blankets over their legs, watching the stars. They'd talk about their day, laugh about something silly, or just sit in silence, holding hands. Frank once told Margaret, "I don't need the whole world, just you." She smiled and replied, "Then we have the whole world, right here." People in town admired their relationship. Young couples would ask them for advice. "How do you stay so happy after all these years?" Margaret would say, "We listen, we forgive, we laugh a lot." Frank would nod and add, "And don't forget the pie. Good pie helps." Frank never questioned Margaret's love, not even once. She had a calm way about her. Even when she was upset, she didn't raise her voice. If something troubled her, she would go for long walks alone, then come back looking peaceful again. Frank always thought it was just her way of thinking things through. She never gave him a reason to doubt her. She was loyal, kind, and always made him feel like he was the most important person in her world. Their children grew up and moved away. David became an engineer, and Emily became a nurse. They visited during holidays and called every weekend. Frank and Margaret, now in their 70s, had grown older together. They had gray hair, wrinkles, and slower steps, but their love remained strong. They still danced in the living room on rainy nights, holding each other close as if they were young again. Margaret's health began to change slowly. At first, she just seemed tired. Then she started forgetting things. Frank noticed when she left the oven on or forgot people's names. The doctor said it was the beginning stages of dementia. Frank was heartbroken, but he never showed it in front of her. Became her caregiver, making sure she took her medicine, helping her dress, and reading her favorite poems before bed. Every day, he told her, "You're still my girl." Despite the illness, Margaret still had moments of clarity. Sometimes she would look at Frank with tears in her eyes and whisper, "I'm sorry." He would hold her hand and say, "You don't need to be sorry for anything." But deep down, he didn't understand why she kept saying that. What was she sorry for? One evening, while sitting in bed, Margaret suddenly asked, "Do you remember the summer of 1971? Frank smiled and said, "Of course. That was the year you went to take care of your sick sister." Margaret stared at him for a long time, her eyes full of emotion. "There's something I never told you about that summer," she whispered. Frank's heart skipped a beat. He leaned in, waiting for her to speak, but she looked away, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I'll tell you tomorrow," she said softly, but tomorrow never came. That night, Margaret's health worsened. Had trouble breathing? Frank called Emily, and they rushed her to the hospital. The doctors did their best, but Margaret's body was too weak. She passed away in her sleep, with Frank holding her hand and whispering how much he loved her. Frank was shattered. The woman he had spent 60 years with, the love of his life, was gone. And now, he was left with her last words echoing in his mind. "There's something I never told you about that summer." He didn't know what it meant, but it wouldn't let him sleep. Frank tried to tell himself that maybe it wasn't anything big. Maybe it was just a forgotten detail. Something harmless, but deep inside, he felt a strange pain. Like a tiny crack in his perfect world had suddenly turned into something deeper. As the days passed and the house grew quieter, Frank began to wonder if he had really known everything about Margaret. He never doubted her, never questioned her. Choices never read her diary. But now, he couldn't stop thinking about what she wanted to tell him before she died. Something she had kept inside for all those years. And so, as Frank sat alone in their old living room, staring at the empty porch swing, he felt the first stirrings of something unfamiliar doubt. Not about her love, but about a part of her life he had never seen. A secret that had lived beside him for 6 decades. A story he hadn't known he was part of. He didn't know it yet, but the life he thought he knew was about to change forever. Because sometimes, even the deepest love can hold a hidden chapter. And Frank was about to discover one that would shake the foundation of everything he believed. After Margaret's death, everything in the house felt empty and silent. Frank could still hear her voice in his head, still see her sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea, still feel her presence in every corner. But she was gone. Now, something inside him had changed too. Before she died, she had tried to tell him something about the summer of 1971. She never got to finish her sentence. That moment haunted Frank every single day. He kept asking himself what she meant. Why did she bring up that summer? Why did her voice sound so heavy? Almost like she was carrying something painful. Frank remembered that summer clearly. It was when she told him she needed to go stay with her older sister, Helen, who had fallen seriously ill. Margaret had packed a small bag and left for nearly 2 months. Frank had stayed home, working and looking after their little boy, David, who was just 3 years old then. At the time, he didn't think much of it. He trusted her completely. If Margaret said she was going to take care of her sister, that's what she was doing. But now, after 60 years of living together, after sharing a life built on love and loyalty, Margaret had brought that summer up again just days before her death. Frank couldn't forget the look in her eyes when she said, "There's something I never told you about that summer." That sentence felt like a tiny crack in the glass window of his heart. The crack was growing with each passing. Frank started to look at things differently. He began remembering small things he had long forgotten. He remembered how, during that summer, Margaret didn't write many letters to him, only 2 short notes. Usually she was the type to write every week, even if it was just about the weather or a pie she had baked. But that summer there was silence. He remembered asking her once during a phone call if everything was okay. She had paused and said, "It's just been very busy." At the time, Frank didn't push for details. he never liked to doubt her. After the funeral, their daughter Emily came to stay with Frank for a few days to help him sort through things. She was gentle, kind like her mother, and very close to Frank. One afternoon, while they were in the attic, sorting through old boxes of clothes and photo albums, Frank hesitated. He didn't know whether to tell Emily what her mother had said before dying. Part of him wanted to keep it private. Part of him needed help. So he told Emily about Margaret's last words, about the summer of 1971, about the unfinished sentence, and how it had been bothering him. Emily sat quietly for a while, then looked at him and said, "Maybe she left something behind. Maybe she wrote it down." Frank hadn't thought of that. Margaret had always been someone who wrote things in her diary. She kept journals, letters, and notes carefully tucked away, wasn't careless with her memories. So the next day, Frank and Emily began searching the house more closely. They went through old drawers, suitcases, and even behind bookshelves. Nothing. Then, Emily found an old cedar chest tucked away at the back of the attic. It was dusty, with a faded lock that had rusted over time. Inside, wrapped in a piece of cloth, was a small wooden box tied with a ribbon. When they opened it, Frank felt his heart stop. Inside were several neatly folded letters, all addressed to my dearest Margaret. The handwriting wasn't Frank's. It belonged to someone named James. Emily gently picked up one of the letters and looked at her father. "Do you want me to read it?" she asked softly. Frank nodded. The letter was dated July 1971. It began with warm words. "My beloved Margaret, not a day goes by that I don't think of you." It spoke of love, of longing, of quiet promises. The words were romantic, emotional, and deeply personal. The man talked about a summer that changed everything. He mentioned a child, promise, and a decision to let Margaret return to her. Life, to keep the secret safe. Frank felt like he couldn't breathe. His hands were shaking. He picked up another letter. And another. They all carried the same tone: affection, regret, and a painful goodbye. The last letter said, "I will never blame you. I understand why you chose the life you did. But know that a part of you will always live with me, just as a part of me will always be with you and the child." The child. Frank dropped the letter. His world felt upside down. Had Margaret loved someone else? Had she had a child? Was it during that summer, the one he had always believed was spent helping her sister? Emily sat beside him, her face pale with shock. "Dad," she whispered, "do you think Mom had another baby? Before me?" Frank didn't know what to say. His mind was full of noise. He had spent his entire life believing that Margaret had never kept a secret from him. She had been his best friend, his partner, his whole world. And now he was holding letters that told him there had been a part of her life, a very big, very painful part that he knew nothing about. He didn't want to believe it, but the letters were real. The emotions in them were real. The dates matched. It all pointed to something Margaret had never spoken of, something she had carried quietly. In her heart for decades, Frank sat in silence for a long time. Emily didn't push him. She knew he was hurting in a way she couldn't fix. Later that night, Frank went into Margaret's room alone. He sat by her side of the bed and stared at the pillow where her head once rested. He held one of the letters and whispered, "Why? Didn't you tell me?" He wasn't angry. He was heartbroken. More than the secret itself, it was the thought that Margaret had lived all these years with something so heavy on her chest. She had laughed, loved, and shared a life with him, but never told him the full story. What pain had she buried inside her heart for all those years? Frank started thinking more deeply. If there was a child, then where was he or she? Had Margaret stayed in touch with them? Did the child know who their mother was? Did they even know they existed? Frank couldn't sleep that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He kept hearing Margaret's voice in his head, her soft whisper saying, "There's something I never told you about that summer." That unfinished sentence kept playing over and over like a broken record. In the morning, Frank told Emily he wanted to find the truth. He needed to know what really happened, Emily agreed. She was just as curious and emotional as her father. It wasn't just about uncovering a mystery anymore. It was about understanding who Margaret really was beyond the loving wife and mother. They knew, so they began their search. They looked through old records, newspaper clippings, and hospital archives. They checked birth certificates from that year in the town where Margaret had stayed. Emily made phone calls, contacted adoption centers, and even searched online forums. Frank felt like he was chasing a ghost. But he couldn't stop. He needed closure, needed to understand the part of Margaret's life she never shared. Every step forward brought more questions. But one thing was clear. Margaret had made a choice. She had loved someone else maybe before or during their marriage, and that love had resulted in a child. But for some reason, she chose to return to Frank and never speak of it again. Frank didn't know whether to feel betrayed or sad. In truth, he felt both. He still loved Margaret. That love hadn't died with the letters. But he also felt a deep ache, knowing that the woman he trusted with his entire life had carried such a huge secret alone. As they continued digging, Emily found a birth record from 1971. A baby boy born in the same town Margaret had. Visited, the mother's name, Margaret M. Weston. The father's name, not listed. Frank froze. That was her. It had to be. Margaret Weston was her maiden name. The baby's name was Thomas. No other records were linked to him. It looked like he had been adopted or placed into foster care. Now Frank had a name. A possible son of his wife. A man who, if the letters were true, was Margaret's child. Frank sat quietly for a long time, holding the birth record in his hands. It felt strange, holding proof of something so life-changing in such a small piece of paper that night. Frank sat again by the window where he and Margaret once shared evening tea. He looked at the stars and spoke aloud as if she were still beside him. "I wish you had told me," he whispered. "I would have listened. I would have understood." But the truth was, Margaret had chosen silence. Maybe out of shame. Maybe to protect him. Maybe because she didn't want to reopen an old wound. But whatever the reason, that silence had become a wall between them, one he hadn't even known was there. Frank now had a mission. He had to find Thomas. He had to find out the rest of the story. Not because he needed to fix the past, but because he wanted to complete the picture of the woman he loved for 60 years. Even if that truth hurt, it was still part of her. And Frank wanted to know every part of her, even the parts she had kept hidden. Frank sat in the old wooden chair by the window where he and Margaret used to drink tea and watch the world go by. The cup of tea in his hand had gone cold, but he didn't care. His mind was far from the present. He kept looking at the small box of letters. They had found the ones written by a man named James to his beloved Margaret. The letters had shaken him deeply. He still loved Margaret with all his heart, but now a part of him felt like he didn't truly know her. 60 years of marriage, and yet she had carried a secret so heavy that she took it to her grave. Frank thought about the summer of 1971 over and over again. Back then, Margaret had said she was going to help her sister who was sick. But now, he believed that wasn't the whole truth. The letters talked about love, a child, and a painful goodbye. Margaret had left their little family that summer not just to help someone, but to face something big, something life-changing. And now that past had come crashing into Frank's quiet world. For the next few days, Frank kept himself busy reading through the letters again and again. Each one was like a piece of a puzzle, but the picture was still incomplete. Some letters were romantic and full of longing. Others were more serious, talking about a decision they had made. One letter even mentioned Margaret crying every night, because she didn't know what to do. The last letter was the hardest for Frank to read. James had written, "I'll never forget what we had, and I'll never stop wondering about the child we created. But I respect your choice. Go back to your life, and I'll disappear." Frank didn't sleep much. Every night he lay in bed, his thoughts spinning. He kept thinking about the child. If that child was real and everything pointed to that being true, then where was he now? Did he even know who his mother was? Did he have a family of his own? Had he grown up feeling unwanted? Frank's heart ached with questions at Emily. His daughter stayed with him during this time. She was just as shocked as her father. She hadn't expected to find anything like this. At first, she didn't know what to say to Frank. She worried he would break under the weight of it all. But Frank wasn't angry. He was heartbroken, confused and filled with a need to understand. "I just want to know the truth," he told Emily one morning. "I want to know why your mother never told me. I want to know who that child was. And if he's out there, maybe he deserves to know too." Emily nodded. She understood. So she began helping him search. They already had a name, Thomas. They also had the birth year and the city where he was born. That was enough to begin. They searched through public records, old hospital data, and adoption listings. But it wasn't easy. So many records from that time were paper-based and incomplete. Emily made phone calls to local offices, asked for help from distant cousins, and even checked online forums for adopted children looking for their birth parents. After days of digging, they found something, a small adoption record from the same hospital and same week when Thomas was born. The record didn't list the names of the adoptive parents, but it confirmed that a baby boy named Thomas had been placed in foster care in July 1971. That was all the proof Frank needed. Margaret had given birth to a baby boy, a baby she had kept hidden from her husband for over 60 years. Frank sat quietly for a long time after reading that record. His heart felt like it was being pulled in two different directions. On one side was pain, a deep, cutting pain that the woman he loved had never told him such a big truth. On the other side was sorrow for Margaret, for the secret she carried, and most of all, for the child who may have lived his life not knowing who he really was. "What do we do now?" Emily asked gently. Frank took a deep breath. "We find him," he said. Emily began the search to locate Thomas. She used social media, searched adoption networks, and asked around in forums where people shared stories about finding their birth families. She didn't expect anything quickly. But then, a week later, a woman named Rachel replied to one of Emily's messages on a genealogy website. Rachel said her father, Thomas, had recently discovered he was adopted. He had always wondered about his birth mother. When Rachel described her father's birth year, city, and early records, everything matched. Emily's heart started beating faster. She replied immediately, explaining who they were, but carefully. She didn't want to scare them away. That evening, Frank waited at the table while Emily made a phone call. It was Rachel on the other end. She was kind, polite, and very emotional. She said Thomas had spent his life wondering why he had been given away. He had grown up in foster care, then adopted by a good family. But there was always a part of him that felt missing. Said he finally had a name, Margaret. When Emily hung up, she looked at Frank and said, "They want to talk. Thomas wants to talk to you." Frank was stunned. All this time, he had only imagined the boy as a baby, wrapped in blankets, being taken away. But now he was a man, a grown man with a family of his own. A man who had questions too. They decided to write a letter first. Frank wanted to say everything in his own words. He sat down and began writing slowly, pouring his heart onto paper. He told Thomas about Margaret, about their long marriage, about how much she loved her family. He admitted that he never knew about Thomas until after Margaret died, and that he was still trying to understand it all. He wrote honestly and kindly, didn't blame Margaret and he didn't blame Thomas. Simply wrote, "I want to know. I want to know the part of Margaret that she kept hidden. I believe you deserve that." He sent the letter with trembling hands. The wait was painful. Every day, Frank checked the mailbox. A week passed. Then finally an envelope came. It was addressed in careful handwriting, and when Frank opened it, his hands shook. The letter inside was from Thomas. Thomas wrote that he had read Frank's letter many times, said he had spent his whole life wondering about his birth mother. He found out she had passed away. He felt something break inside. But then, he read Frank's letter, and it gave him peace. He said he was open to meeting slowly, and getting to know the family he never knew he had. Frank cried when he read the letter. All these years, he thought his life with Margaret was complete. But now he realized there had been another part of her story, a part she had kept locked away. It didn't make him stop loving her. If anything, he loved her more. He saw her not just as his wife, but as a human being who had made a hard decision, and carried the weight of it silently for decades. A few weeks later, they arranged a meeting. Thomas, his daughter Rachel, Emily, and Frank met at a small cafe halfway between their cities. Frank was nervous, didn't know what to say, how to act, or what Thomas would look like. But the moment he saw him, something clicked. Thomas looked a lot like Margaret. He had her eyes, her calm expression, and the same kind of quiet strength. When they shook hands, it felt like more than just a greeting, it felt like a connection. They sat and talked for hours. Frank told him stories about Margaret, the way she laughed, the way she loved her garden, and the songs she used to hum while cooking. Thomas listened quietly, his eyes filled with emotion. He shared about his own life, his childhood, his family, and the pain of not knowing his roots. At the end of the meeting, Thomas said something that Frank would never forget. "I don't blame her," he said softly. "She made a choice. Maybe it wasn't easy, but I think she tried to do what she thought was right." Frank nodded. "She loved deeply," he replied, "even when it hurt her." They hugged before leaving. It was not the kind of hug that erased all the years of silence, but it was a beginning, step toward healing. That night, Frank sat by the window again, just like he had so many times. The stars were out and the wind was soft. He held a picture of Margaret in his hands. "I met him," he whispered. "He's a good man. You'd be proud." And in that quiet moment, Frank felt something he hadn't felt in weeks, not sadness, not anger, but peace. Margaret's secret had broken his heart, but it had also led him to someone new, someone who carried a piece of her in his eyes. The truth had come late, but it had come, and in its light, love still lived. Frank's life had completely changed in the last few weeks. He was no longer just a widower who had lost his wife of 60 years. He was now a man chasing the truth about the woman he thought he knew better than anyone. The letters had opened a door to a hidden part of Margaret's life, and what was behind that door was both painful and emotional. Even after all the time they had spent together, Frank realized there was still more to discover. And the most important discovery was a man named Thomas, Margaret's hidden son. After their first emotional meeting, Frank couldn't stop thinking about Thomas. The way he looked, the way he listened, the way he smiled, it all reminded Frank of Margaret. It was as if a part of her had come back into his life. Even though Frank was still trying to understand everything, he knew one thing for sure. He wanted to know Thomas better. Thomas had grown up without knowing who his real mother was. He had always felt a sense of emptiness, especially during family gatherings or holidays. His adoptive parents were kind and loving, but deep inside, Thomas had always wondered, where do I really come from? When he found out the truth, that his mother had been Margaret, a woman who had lived a quiet and beautiful life, he felt a strange mix of sadness and peace. Frank decided to visit Thomas in his city. Emily went with him. They took a train. And the whole way, Frank stared out the window thinking, what would they talk about? Would it feel strange? Would Thomas want a real relationship? Or was he only meeting them to get answers? When they arrived, Thomas welcomed them warmly. He had a small, cozy house with family photos on the walls. One picture showed Thomas holding his daughter Rachel when she was a baby. Another showed him graduating from college. Frank walked through the house slowly, looking at the life Thomas had built. A life that Margaret had never been part of, but one that somehow connected them all. They sat down for dinner. Rachel had made homemade pasta, and they laughed and talked like old friends. At one point, Thomas brought out a small box. Inside was a faded baby blanket, a hospital bracelet, and an envelope. It was all he had from the time before he was adopted. "This bracelet has my birth name," Thomas said. "It's just Baby Boy Weston. I didn't know until recently that it was your wife's last name before she married you." Frank looked at the bracelet, feeling tears rise. That small piece of plastic connected him to a child he never knew existed, and to a woman he had loved all his life. After dinner, the conversation turned more serious. Frank asked the question that had been in his heart for weeks. "Do you hate her for giving you away?" Thomas shook his head. "No, I've thought about it a lot. I don't know why she made that choice, but I've decided not to judge her. Life must have been complicated. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she thought she was doing the best thing. All I know is she loved you and you loved her. That has to mean something. Frank nodded slowly. It did mean something. It meant everything. In the following weeks, they stayed in touch. Thomas visited Frank's home, walked through the garden Margaret used to take care of, and even sat in her favorite chair by the fireplace. He saw the photos on the wall, heard stories from Emily, and looked through old albums. One day Frank handed Thomas a small leather diary. This was hers, he said. She used to write in it every night. I never read it while she was alive. I believed in giving her her space, but maybe now it's time, Thomas hesitated. He opened the diary gently and began reading. Margaret's handwriting was soft and neat. At first it was simple notes about cooking, gardening, or something funny Frank had said. But then came a date that stood out. July 5th, 1971. Thomas read quietly. That entry changed everything. Today I held him for the first time. My baby boy. He has my nose, my eyes. I didn't want to let go, but I had to. Made a choice. I looked into his face and promised I'd always love him, even if I couldn't keep him. Thomas stopped reading. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, with a shaky voice, he whispered, "She did love me. She just couldn't keep me." Frank nodded, unable to speak. In that moment, the air between them was heavy with emotion. For Thomas, it was the first real proof that his mother had loved him. For Frank, it was the first time he truly understood how much pain Margaret had silently carried. Later, Frank sat alone on the porch, looking at the sky. He thought about the day Margaret left for that summer. She had hugged him, kissed David, and told him she'd be back soon. She had smiled, but now he remembered something else, a strange look in her eyes, like she was holding back tears. He had never questioned it then, but now he saw it clearly. She hadn't just gone to help her sister, she had gone to bring a life into the world. A life she had to give up. Frank wondered why she had never told him, why she chose silence. Maybe she was afraid he wouldn't understand. Maybe she didn't want to hurt him. Maybe it was just too painful to talk about. Whatever the reason, she had buried that part of her story deep inside and carried it with her until the end. But now the truth had come out, and strangely, it had brought healing. One afternoon, Thomas and Frank went to visit Margaret's grave. They brought flowers, roses, her favorite. Frank stood quietly for a moment, then began speaking softly. "I wish you had told me, one wish. You hadn't carried this pain alone, but I forgive you, and I still love you." Thomas stepped forward. He placed a small stone on the grave, a tradition he had learned from his adoptive mother's family. Then he said, "Thank you for giving me life. I understand now." They stood together in silence, a father and a son connected by the same woman, one through marriage, the other through blood. When they left the cemetery, Frank felt lighter, not because the sadness was gone, but because he finally understood Margaret more completely. She had made a hard choice. She had lived with it, and even though she had never spoken of it, she had never forgotten. The more Frank talked to Thomas, the more he liked him. They shared the same love for old books, the same calm nature, even the same habit of sitting quietly when deep in thought. Frank sometimes wondered what life might have been like if Margaret had told him the truth years ago. Would they have raised Thomas together? Would their children have grown up as siblings? But he didn't let those thoughts turn into regret. Instead, he focused on the present. He had found Thomas now. It wasn't too late to build something new. One day, Thomas asked Frank something unexpected. "Do you think she loved him? The man who wrote those letters?" Frank thought for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, I think she did. Maybe not the way she loved me, but she loved him in some way. Enough to write back, enough to keep those letters all her life." Thomas looked down. "I think that's okay. People can love more than once." Frank smiled sadly. "Yes, they can, but she chose to come back to me. That means something too." That truth gave Frank peace. Margaret had a past, like everyone, but in the end, she had chosen a life with him, a home, a family. She had poured herself into their love. Even if a part of her heart still carried a hidden sorrow, Frank and Thomas spent more time together. They went fishing, took long walks, and talked late into the night. Slowly, a bond formed between them. It wasn't forced. It wasn't rushed. It grew naturally, like a seed that had waited for the right season to bloom. Emily was happy to see her father smile again. She and Rachel became close too, sharing stories about their childhoods and laughing at the strange way their families had come together. One evening, the whole group gathered for dinner at Frank's house. It was the first time it truly felt like a family. There was laughter, good food, and a sense of peace in the air. At one point, Emily stood up and raised a toast. To Margaret, she said, "A woman who loved deeply, even when life was complicated." Everyone lifted their glasses. "Margaret," they echoed, and in that moment, Frank felt her presence. Not in a ghostly way, but in the warmth of the room, the laughter of their children, and the way Thomas looked at him with respect and kindness. Margaret was gone, but her love remained in the people she had touched, in the lives she had shaped, and in the family she had unknowingly reunited. The search for the truth had been painful, but it had also brought healing. Frank had lost his wife, but he had gained a son. He had discovered a part of her past, and in doing so, he had understood her more deeply than ever before. He didn't need to ask why she had hidden the truth anymore. He had found the answer in her letters, her diary, and most importantly, in her heart, and for the first time since her passing. Frank no longer felt like something was missing. He had found the missing piece, and it was love. Frank sat on the same wooden chair near the window where he had spent many quiet mornings with Margaret. But now the house felt empty. Margaret was gone, and all that remained was silence and a box of letters that had changed everything he believed about their life together. The words written by James haunted him. The idea that his wife, the woman he loved for 60 years, had a secret child with another man was something he couldn't fully accept. Yet the letters told the story clearly. He could no longer pretend it wasn't real. Emily, their daughter, stayed with him for a few weeks. She helped him cook, clean, and comforted him as best she could. But she could also see the heavy weight on her father's shoulders. Frank was not the same man anymore. He looked like he was still in shock, as if a part of him had been stolen. Emily didn't push him to talk, but one evening over tea, she gently placed her hand over his and asked, "Do you want to find him?" Frank didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window, watching the wind move the trees. Then he nodded slowly. "I think I have to," he whispered. "Not just for me, but for him, if he exists, if he's real. He deserves to know who his mother was." They began the search quietly. Emily had a friend who worked at a library and knew how to go through old birth records. They went back to the summer of 1971 when Margaret had told Frank she was going to take care of her sister. Instead, she'd given birth to a child. After many hours digging through dusty boxes and yellowed pages, they found something, an old birth certificate. A boy, born that summer. The mother's name was Margaret Rose Caldwell. No father listed. The place, the time, it all matched. It was her. The child's name was Thomas. He had been adopted through a private agency. There wasn't much information about his life after that. But Emily, being younger and more tech-savvy, started searching online. She used social media, genealogy websites, and public directories. Finally, after many days and sleepless nights, she found a man named Thomas with a birth date that matched. He lived in Illinois now, ran a small hardware store, and had a family of his own. Frank stared at the screen. This man Thomas could be his wife's son, his wife's secret. Frank's fingers trembled as he reached for a pen and paper. Emily offered to email him, but Frank shook his head. "This is something I need to do by hand," he said. He wanted the words to feel personal, real, human. The letter took him 2 full days to write. He didn't know how to begin or what to say. What could he possibly write to a man he'd never met, claiming to be the husband of his birth mother? In the end, Frank wrote honestly. He told Thomas about Margaret, their long life together, the recent discovery of the letters, the search that led him to believe Thomas might be her child. He apologized if the letter caused any pain or confusion. He didn't ask for anything, not even a reply, just wanted to share the truth, in case it meant something. They mailed the letter with no return address, only a P.O. box that Frank had set up in case Thomas wanted to respond. And then they waited. Days passed. Then weeks. Frank tried to stay busy, going through old photo albums, watering Margaret's plants, fixing broken things in the house that didn't really need fixing. But his mind was never still. Every knock at the door, every rustle of mail, every ring of the phone made his heart race. One morning, a letter finally arrived. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The return address was from Illinois. Frank opened it slowly. His eyes filled with tears as he read. Thomas had written back. The letter was polite, cautious, but not angry. Thomas thanked Frank for reaching out. He admitted that he had grown up in foster care and was later adopted by a kind couple. He had always wondered about his real parents, especially his mother. Only recently had he started looking into his past, trying to learn more. He had not expected to receive a letter like Frank's, but something inside him told him it was true. There were too many matching details, and in the letter, Frank had mentioned a locket. Margaret always wore one with a small picture inside of a baby's foot. Thomas remembered seeing that locket in a photo once, long ago. On a website of unclaimed adoption records, Thomas ended the letter by saying he didn't know what to feel yet, but he was open to meeting Frank. Frank was willing. Frank folded the letter gently and pressed it to his chest. He cried, quietly, for a long time. Not just because of the pain, but because of the relief. There was a chance to do something right. To bring a missing piece back into the story, Emily helped arrange the meeting. A few weeks later, Frank and Thomas met at a quiet park halfway between Ohio and Illinois. It was early autumn, and the leaves were turning golden. Frank arrived early, sitting nervously on a bench. When Thomas walked toward him, Frank knew instantly. It was like seeing Margaret's eyes again, but in a different face. They shook hands at first, unsure of what to do. Then, slowly, Thomas sat beside Frank, and they began to talk. At first, it was small talk about the weather, the park, the drive, but soon the conversation turned deeper. Frank told stories about Margaret, her laugh, her kindness, how she loved humming while baking pies, and how she would always talk to birds in the garden like they were old friends.
Oh.
Thomas listened with quiet eyes, then he asked, "Why didn't she keep me?" Frank paused. He looked down at his hands. "I don't know," he said softly. "She never told me. I wish I had asked. I think maybe she was scared. Maybe she thought it would change everything." Right. Thomas nodded. He didn't seem angry, just sad. "I used to wonder if my mother ever thought about me," he said. "No, I know she did. All her life, probably." Frank placed a hand gently on Thomas's shoulder. "She did," he said. "I'm sure of it." The meeting ended with a hug, not long, not dramatic, but strong. Beginning. In the months that followed, Thomas visited Frank a few more times. Emily welcomed him warmly, and soon her children began calling Thomas uncle. At first it felt strange. Slowly, something warm began to grow between them. A quiet bond. Not forced, just honest. One day, Thomas brought a small wooden box. Inside it was the locket Frank had mentioned in the letter, the same locket Margaret had worn all those years. Thomas had found it in a lost and found archive connected to his adoption files. "I think this belongs with you," he said. Frank took it with trembling hands. That night, Frank sat by the window holding the locket. Inside was the tiny photo of the baby's foot. Now he knew whose it was. He whispered into the quiet Margaret, "I forgive you." Years later, when Frank passed away peacefully in his sleep, Thomas and Emily stood side by side at the funeral. Thomas gave a short speech, not as a long-lost son, not as a mystery from the past, but as family. He spoke of love, of truth, of pain that led to healing. He thanked Frank for his courage, for his kindness, for his heart. And though the story had started with a terrible secret, it ended with connection, with forgiveness, and with love that found its way after 60 years of silence.